In the quiet towns and cities of Europe, before the thunder of war began, life had its rhythm. Children played in the cobblestone streets, mothers sold bread at the market, and fathers returned home with the day's labor written in dust and sweat on their faces. In those same streets, Jewish families had lived for centuries, part of the social fabric, part of the cultural heartbeat of Europe. Yet beneath that fragile peace, an ancient hatred was waiting, silent but never gone. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, his words carried not just political ambition, but poison. He spoke of purity, of race, of destiny, and millions listened. Germany, wounded by the humiliation of World War I and the crushing weight of the Treaty of Versailles, was fertile ground for anger, for fear, for the lies of a man who promised greatness through destruction. The Nazi ideology was not born in a day. It evolved from centuries of anti-Semitism, from myths that painted Jews as enemies of progress, conspirators, and parasites. Hitler weaponized those myths, giving them a face, a name, and a purpose. His speeches were filled with venom, his propaganda machine turning neighbors into spies, friends into enemies. By the time the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, German Jews were stripped of their citizenship, their rights, and soon, their humanity. The world watched in silence, believing that such madness could not last, that reason would return. But reason had already been replaced by fear. When war erupted in 1939, the machinery of hatred began to move faster. Poland fell first, and with it, millions of Jews found themselves trapped under Nazi control. Ghettos were built, cramped, filthy, disease-ridden enclosures where families of 6 or more shared a single room. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Barbed wire replaced neighborhood fences. Within the Warsaw Ghetto, once a vibrant community of artists and merchants, children scavenged for bread while soldiers patrolled with rifles and whips. It was not just imprisonment, it was a slow, deliberate death. The ghettos were only the beginning. In 1941, as the German army advanced into the Soviet Union, a new phase of the Holocaust began. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the army's path, rounding up Jewish men, women, and children in towns and villages. They were taken to forests and fields, ordered to dig their own graves, and shot in mass executions. At Babi Yar near Kiev, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. The gunfire echoed across the ravine, but the world still did not listen.
Soon, the Nazis decided that bullets were too slow, too inefficient. What they needed was a system, something that could kill faster, quieter, with industrial precision. The final solution was born. At Wannsee, a villa near Berlin, top Nazi officials gathered in January 1942 to discuss logistics, not whether millions would die, but how to make it happen efficiently. The Holocaust became an operation, a cold bureaucratic project. Engineers designed gas chambers, railway companies scheduled deportations, guards and clerks filled out forms. Murder became administration. Trains began to roll across Europe, cattle cars filled with families, their belongings piled beside them. They were told they were being resettled. They were herded into stations, separated from their loved ones, and crammed into sealed wagons with no food, no water, and no air. The destination: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Chelmno, Belzec, names that would become symbols of horror.
At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the death camps, the process was terrifyingly efficient. Upon arrival, prisoners were divided.
Those deemed fit for work were sent one way, the rest, the elderly, the sick, mothers with children, another. They were told they were going to take a shower. Instead, they entered gas chambers disguised as bathhouses. Zyklon B pellets were dropped through openings in the ceiling. Within minutes, silence. The bodies were dragged out, gold teeth extracted, hair shaved, and corpses burned in crematoria that ran day and night. Amidst the ashes, humanity flickered. Some prisoners tried to resist. In 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto rose in rebellion. Men and women with almost no weapons fought German tanks with Molotov cocktails and stolen guns. Their bravery lasted weeks before the ghetto was reduced to rubble. In 1944, prisoners at Auschwitz destroyed a crematorium in a desperate revolt. Each act of resistance was a cry against the impossible, proof that even in hell, the human spirit refused to die.
In the quiet towns and cities of Europe, before the thunder of war began, life had its rhythm. Children played in the cobblestone streets, mothers sold bread at the market, and fathers returned home with the day's labor written in dust and sweat on their faces. In those same streets, Jewish families had lived for centuries, part of the social fabric, part of the cultural heartbeat of Europe. Yet beneath that fragile peace, an ancient hatred was waiting, silent but never gone. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, his words carried not just political ambition, but poison. He spoke of purity, of race, of destiny, and millions listened. Germany, wounded by the humiliation of World War I and the crushing weight of the Treaty of Versailles, was fertile ground for anger, for fear, for the lies of a man who promised greatness through destruction. The Nazi ideology was not born in a day. It evolved from centuries of anti-Semitism, from myths that painted Jews as enemies of progress, conspirators, and parasites. Hitler weaponized those myths, giving them a face, a name, and a purpose. His speeches were filled with venom, his propaganda machine turning neighbors into spies, friends into enemies. By the time the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, German Jews were stripped of their citizenship, their rights, and soon, their humanity. The world watched in silence, believing that such madness could not last, that reason would return. But reason had already been replaced by fear.
But the numbers grew. 6 million Jews, 1.5 million children, entire generations erased. Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, homosexuals, and Slavs, all were victims of a machine built for extermination. The Holocaust was not a moment of madness. It was a system of methodical evil, planned, documented, and carried out by ordinary men who convinced themselves they were just following orders. As Allied forces advanced in 1945, they began to uncover the camps. The gates of Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Auschwitz opened to reveal mountains of corpses, skeletons of survivors, and the smell of death that no words could describe. Soldiers wept, reporters fainted, cameras rolled, but even film could not capture the scale of what had been done. When the war ended, the world faced a mirror it could not bear to look into. The Nuremberg trials sought to bring justice, but how do you judge crimes so vast, so inhuman? Nazi leaders stood in the dock, their arrogance replaced by fear. They said they were not guilty, that they obeyed orders, that they had no choice. Yet the evidence, the documents, the photographs, the testimonies told another story. For the first time in history, crimes against humanity became a legal term, but no verdict could resurrect the dead. The Holocaust left scars that will never heal. Survivors carried their trauma in silence, haunted by memories of screams, smoke, and loss. Many could never speak again. Others dedicated their lives to remembrance, to warning the world that such evil can happen anywhere, anytime, if hatred goes unchecked. In Israel, the survivors built a homeland from ashes. In Germany, generations grew up under the weight of guilt and reflection. Across the world, museums and memorials rose to preserve the memory. Yad Vashem, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Auschwitz itself, silent witnesses to unspeakable horror.
When the liberation of the camps began, the world was not ready to see what waited behind the barbed wire. In Buchenwald, soldiers from the U.S. Army stumbled upon skeletal figures who could barely stand, their eyes hollow, their voices broken. In Bergen-Belsen, British troops walked through fields of unburied bodies. Typhus had ravaged the camp, and survivors were dying even after the gates were opened. The liberators did what they could. They brought food, medicine, blankets, but it was too late for many. The survivors would later say that freedom came like a whisper, not a shout. It was too heavy to celebrate. In Auschwitz, the Soviet soldiers who entered in January 1945 found piles of shoes, glasses, hair, and ash. The Nazis had tried to destroy the evidence, burning documents and blowing up crematoria, but the truth was too vast to erase. The few remaining prisoners who were too weak to be evacuated were living ghosts. One of them, Primo Levi, would later write that to understand is impossible, but to know is necessary. Those words became a cornerstone for how humanity would try to face the Holocaust, not to comprehend its evil, but to ensure it is never forgotten.
After liberation came chaos. Europe was in ruins, cities flattened, nations shattered. Millions were displaced, refugees with nowhere to return. The Jewish survivors who had lost their families, their homes, and their entire communities wandered through what was called the displaced persons camps. Some searched for surviving relatives, posting names on message boards, waiting for miracles that rarely came. Others simply wanted to leave Europe altogether. Many found new beginnings in Palestine, the United States, or South America. Yet the pain of memory traveled with them. They had survived the Holocaust, but survival was only the beginning of a new kind of struggle, to live with the past. The question that haunted the world was, how could this happen? How could doctors, teachers, engineers, and ordinary citizens participate in such horror? The Nuremberg trials in 1945 tried to answer that question through law. 22 of the most powerful Nazi leaders were put on trial for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The courtroom was filled with the ghosts of millions. The defendants sat in silence as footage of the camps was shown, as witnesses spoke of children torn from their mothers, as survivors recounted days of smoke and screams.
For many, it was the first time they truly saw the magnitude of the Holocaust. The evidence was undeniable. Train schedules, gas orders, meticulous Nazi records that listed names and numbers. Bureaucracy had become an instrument of death. The verdicts were mixed. Some were sentenced to death, others to prison, and a few acquitted. Yet the trials marked the birth of a new era of international justice. The words "never again" began to echo through the halls of nations, but history would prove that remembering is not the same as preventing. In the years that followed, the Holocaust shaped everything: politics, religion, philosophy, and human rights.
The creation of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 were direct responses to the crimes uncovered in the camps. The world finally acknowledged that silence is complicity, that neutrality in the face of evil is itself a moral failure. The State of Israel was founded the same year, offering a homeland for Jews after 2,000 years of exile and persecution. But even that dream carried the weight of grief. The survivors who arrived in the new land brought with them memories that could not be buried. They built homes, schools, and cities, but every success was shadowed by loss. Over time, artists, writers, and filmmakers tried to give voice to the unspeakable. Books like Night by Elie Wiesel, If This Is a Man by Primo Levi, and The Diary of Anne Frank became testaments of survival and warning. Each story was a fragment of the same truth, that the Holocaust was not an accident of history, but the result of choices, of indifference, of hate allowed to grow unchecked. In classrooms across the world, teachers began to tell children about Auschwitz and Treblinka, showing them the images that once shocked the world, hoping to plant empathy where hatred once took root. But memory is fragile. As the decades passed, survivors grew old. Their numbers dwindled. Their voices grew softer. Some feared that as they vanished, so too would the truth. In some corners of the world, denial began to spread. People claiming it never happened, that the photos were lies, that the victims were exaggerated. This denial was a second death, an assault on truth itself. To fight it, museums and memorials rose. In Jerusalem, Yad Vashem stands as a silent mountain of memory. In Washington, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum teaches visitors what happens when prejudice becomes policy. In Germany, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe spreads across Berlin like a field of gray stone, a landscape of mourning and reflection.
Even in the 21st century, the echoes of the Holocaust can still be heard. In the faces of refugees fleeing war, in the rise of extremist ideologies, in the slogans of hate that resurface when societies forget their lessons. The Holocaust is not only a memory of the past, it is a warning for the future. Because genocide does not begin with camps or gas chambers, it begins with words, with silence, with the belief that some lives matter less than others. For those who survived, life after the Holocaust was a complex journey of rebuilding. Some found faith again, others lost it forever. Some spoke endlessly, others never uttered a word about their experiences. Yet every survivor carried within them a story that defined what it means to endure. They became living reminders that even in the darkest night, the human spirit can resist, can hope, can rebuild.
The children of survivors, the second generation, inherited the trauma in quiet ways. They grew up surrounded by unspoken grief, by parents who woke screaming from nightmares, by family photos with faces that no one could name. Many of them turned to writing, art, and activism to process what they could not escape. Through them, the Holocaust continued to live, not as an open wound, but as a solemn responsibility to remember.
The Holocaust did not end when the camps were liberated. Its shadows stretch across the decades, haunting the conscience of humanity. Every generation that follows inherits a question. How could this have happened? And perhaps even more importantly, could it happen again? The truth is unsettling. The same forces that once fueled such evil, fear, propaganda, and dehumanization, still exist. They may wear new faces, use new words, or spread through new technologies, but the danger remains the same. That is why remembering the Holocaust is not only about the past, but about defending the future. The phrase, "never again," became a vow uttered in grief and anger after 1945. It was carved into memorials, echoed in speeches, and whispered in prayers. But in the decades that followed, humanity witnessed Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, new genocides that showed how fragile those words truly are. Never again is not a promise made once. It is a responsibility renewed by every generation. It demands vigilance, empathy, and courage. The courage to speak out when others stay silent, to see humanity even in those who are different, and to refuse to accept hate as normal.
In classrooms, teachers show photographs of emaciated bodies and piles of shoes, not to shock, but to remind. They teach that the Holocaust began not with camps, but with words. It started with propaganda posters, school lessons twisted with lies, laws that turned citizens into enemies. By the time people realized where it would lead, it was too late. The greatest lesson of the Holocaust is that evil thrives when ordinary people choose comfort over conscience. The guards, the clerks, the engineers, they were not all monsters. They were people who stopped asking questions, who obeyed, who believed it wasn't their responsibility. Today, the survivors' voices are fading, but their words have been recorded, preserved in archives, museums, and digital libraries. Their testimonies speak directly to those who were not yet born. We saw what hate can do. We know where silence leads. You must not forget. These voices, trembling but strong, have become the moral compass of modern civilization. Through them, the Holocaust continues to teach empathy, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience of those who endured the unimaginable.
In Israel, every year on Yom HaShoah, sirens sound across the nation. For 2 minutes, traffic stops, people stand still, heads bowed. The entire country freezes in remembrance. In that silence, the weight of history presses down, a reminder that even in a noisy world, silence can be sacred when it honors memory, but deadly when it ignores suffering. Across Europe, schoolchildren visit Auschwitz, walking among the barracks, touching the cold walls, reading the names carved into the wood. For many, it is their first confrontation with evil that feels real, not from a textbook, but from the echo of footsteps on the same paths where millions once walked to their deaths. The Holocaust also reshaped how humanity defines justice. The term genocide was born from its ashes, coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who lost his family in the war. He dedicated his life to creating laws that would prevent such atrocities. His work inspired the Genocide Convention of 1948, a legal framework that still stands as humanity's defense against its own worst instincts. Yet laws alone are not enough. They must be guarded by moral conviction.
The technological and bureaucratic nature of the Holocaust, the trains, the records, the statistics, forces us to confront a disturbing truth. Progress does not make us moral. The same human creativity that builds can also destroy. The same systems that organize society can be twisted to exterminate. The Holocaust exposed what happens when intelligence is severed from compassion. That is why remembering is not a passive act. It is a choice to keep our humanity alive.
Over time, the Holocaust has also changed how we talk about identity and otherness. Survivors often said they felt invisible, erased. Modern movements for human rights, for equality, and for dignity owe part of their moral foundation to the lessons learned from those years of darkness. The idea that never again applies not only to Jews, but to all people facing persecution, is the living legacy of those who perished. It calls upon everyone, regardless of race, faith, or nation, to recognize the humanity in others.
There is another side to the story too, one of hope. Amid the horror, there were those who refused to be complicit. Ordinary men and women who hid Jewish families, forged papers, or smuggled food into ghettos. People like Oskar Schindler, who saved over 1,000 Jews through his factories, or Irina Sendler, who rescued hundreds of children from the Warsaw Ghetto. Their stories prove that even in the darkest times, the light of compassion can still burn. The Holocaust teaches not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the heights of human courage. As the world moves further from 1945, the responsibility to remember shifts from witnesses to us. We are now the keepers of memory. The Holocaust belongs to history, but its warning belongs to the present. In every act of discrimination, every hateful word, every denial of another's dignity, there is the faint echo of the same forces that once built the camps. And just as the Holocaust began with silence, it can only be prevented by speaking, teaching, and remembering.
At the gates of Auschwitz, a sign still stands. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. Those words, meant as a cruel deception, now stand as a monument to truth. They remind us that freedom is not given, it is defended, not by weapons, but by conscience. Freedom dies not when tyrants rise, but when good people do nothing. As dusk falls on the memory of that time, candles are lit across the world, in synagogues, churches, schools, and homes. The flames flicker gently, fragile yet enduring. Each one represents a life lost, a story untold, a promise remembered. Together, they form a constellation of light against the darkness of forgetting. And so the story continues, not just of death, but of remembrance. The Holocaust stands as the darkest chapter of human history, but also as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In every museum, in every survivor's testimony, in every lesson taught to a new generation, the same message endures. Hatred can destroy, but memory can heal. To remember is to resist.